Danielle Carter walked into the courthouse that morning with a quiet confidence she had honed over years of navigating the legal world from the inside out, a world that had often tested her but never broken her. She had a case to present that day, but it was a minor one, just a traffic violation. She had no doubt she would resolve it quickly and move on with her day. But something about the courthouse that morning felt different. The usual hum of busy lawyers and anxious defendants was replaced by an eerie stillness she couldn't shake. As she walked toward the courtroom, she glanced around at the other faces in the hallway. Most of them were white. A few looked at her with curiosity as she passed, but most didn't pay her much attention. Danielle had long since grown used to being one of the few black professionals in spaces like this. She had made peace with it after years of work and experience, but there was always a small knot in her stomach when she was reminded of it. She entered the courtroom and took a seat toward the back. The case wasn't complex. In fact, it was routine. She had been in and out of courtrooms like this 1,000 times before. Her violation was a simple one. She had run a red light when rushing to an emergency appointment. No one was hurt, no damage was done. And yet here she was facing a judge who would soon determine whether she should be fined. The judge entered and took his seat at the bench. His name was William Harper, a well-regarded figure in the local legal community. His reputation was that of a traditionalist, a stickler for procedure, and a man who believed in fairness. But his fairness came with certain assumptions. He had lived most of his life in a world where people like Danielle were the exception, not the rule. Judge Harper glanced over his papers for a moment before looking up at Danielle. She was prepared to address him with respect and professionalism. After all, that was the standard, but she couldn't help noticing the brief flash of surprise in his eyes as he took in her appearance. Danielle wasn't dressed in a suit that day. She had come straight from a meeting and wore a simple blazer over a blouse and slacks. Her hair was neatly styled in a way that was both practical and professional, but it was also natural and unapologetically her. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, longer than necessary, before he cleared his throat and addressed the court. His voice was stern, but not unfriendly, and Danielle could sense he was trying to assess the situation through a lens that felt familiar but distant. She had been here before. She had seen the way some judges looked at her, as though trying to place her into a box that didn't quite fit. The case proceeded without much incident at first. She explained the circumstances surrounding her violation calmly and succinctly, but when the judge responded, his words carried a certain edge that Danielle hadn't expected. "Well, Miss Carter, it seems you found yourself in a bit of a jam," he said, his tone laced with an almost dismissive quality, as if the situation were more of an inconvenience than an important matter of law. She smiled politely, but something about his words left a bitter taste in her mouth. It wasn't the fine she resented, it was the way he spoke to her, as though she were beneath him, as though her explanation held no weight. As the proceedings continued, Judge Harper seemed to make his decision quickly, too quickly in Danielle's opinion. She was fined with a sum that was much higher than the violation warranted and dismissed without a word of apology or understanding. He simply moved on to the next case. Danielle stood and gathered her things. The room felt smaller as she walked out, her mind racing with thoughts of how unfair it all felt. But she had been in this situation enough times to know that there was no point in arguing it, no point in making a scene. She would let it go for now, but deep down she knew this wasn't the end of it. Danielle walked down the courthouse hallway with her head held high, though her mind was a swirl of emotions. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the subtle condescension. The way Judge Harper had dismissed her case without truly hearing her. The way he had assumed her story didn't matter. He hadn't even looked her in the eye when delivering his decision, his words sharp and dismissive. She could still hear his voice echoing in her head. "Well, Miss Carter, it seems you found yourself in a bit of a jam," as though the entire thing were some inconvenience he couldn't be bothered with. The world of law was supposed to be a meritocracy, a place where facts, evidence, and argument were what mattered, not race, gender, or background. Yet, as Danielle walked out into the bright sunlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that her appearance had been the thing that had swayed the judge's opinion, not the actual facts of the case. She had expected some bias, but not here, not in this space. This was supposed to be different. Her heart tightened in frustration. How many times had she told herself she had earned her place? She was no stranger to being the only black woman in a room full of white men in suits, no stranger to fighting for recognition in spaces where her presence was rarely acknowledged. But today had been different. Today, Judge Harper had made her feel small. As she made her way to her car, the anger simmered beneath the surface. But Danielle wasn't the type to let it consume her. She had learned early on how to navigate a world that didn't always want her there. She had earned her place through hard work, grit, and sheer determination. She wasn't just any attorney. She was a federal prosecutor, one of the best in her field. Her success wasn't a fluke. She had fought tooth and nail for every case, every win, every recognition. She was a force to be reckoned with. But today, she had been reduced to a stereotype, another black woman who didn't belong in a courtroom. Danielle started the engine and drove home, her mind racing with thoughts of the judge. She knew she couldn't let this go. Not this time. She wasn't going to file a complaint or make a scene. She wasn't interested in public outrage or getting caught up in the system's bureaucracy. What she wanted was to make a statement that Judge Harper would never forget. She would show him who she truly was, not just in this case, but in all the work she had done. She was not some naive woman who had wandered into court unprepared. She was a skilled and powerful prosecutor, one who had built her career on doing what others thought was impossible. Over the next few days, Danielle threw herself into her work, focusing on the biggest case of her career, a high-profile corruption trial that had everyone in the legal community talking. The case was massive, involving one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city, a man whose tentacles reached deep into local government and law enforcement. Danielle knew this case would make or break her career, and she was determined to see it through. But as she prepared, a thought kept creeping into her mind. Judge Harper would be the one presiding over the trial. She had to admit, the thought unsettled her. Not because she feared the outcome. She was confident in her abilities, but because she knew the judge would come into this case with a prejudice that she wasn't willing to tolerate. She had faced racism before, in different forms, but never from someone like him. He wasn't just a judge. He was a symbol of everything that had held her back, everything that had told her she didn't belong. But Danielle wasn't going to let that stand in her way. No, this was her chance to show him, and everyone else, exactly who she was. When the time came, Judge Harper would know her name, and he would never forget it. Danielle's life was consumed by the preparation for the trial. Every waking moment was spent reviewing evidence, strategizing with her team, and mentally rehearsing her opening and closing arguments. This case wasn't just another feather in her cap. It was the one that would define her. She had worked for years to climb the ranks, earning the respect of her colleagues, building a reputation as a sharp, unwavering prosecutor, and securing convictions in difficult cases. But this one, involving a wealthy and powerful businessman accused of bribery and racketeering, would be the culmination of everything she had worked for. And yet, in the back of her mind, there was always the thought of Judge Harper. He had been the one to dismiss her in court that day, to assume her case didn't matter. His careless handling of a minor infraction had left a bitter taste in her mouth, and now, knowing he would be the one to oversee the trial, the tension only grew. She was determined to keep her focus on the case itself, to make it about justice, not about him. But she couldn't ignore the reality that the judge had already made up his mind about her, and that bothered her more than she cared to admit. The weeks leading up to the trial felt like a whirlwind. Danielle's team worked tirelessly to prepare for every possible scenario, every argument the defense might throw at them. She wanted to leave nothing to chance. The businessman they were up against, Victor Green, was a master manipulator, his wealth and influence seeping into every corner of the city. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a battle for power. The stakes were enormous, not just for Green, but for the community that had been taken advantage of for so long. Danielle knew that if she lost, it wouldn't just be a personal failure. It would be a failure for the system, for justice itself. One evening, as she sat in her office, going over the final details of the case. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from her assistant, a brief update on the logistics of the trial. Her eyes skimmed over the details until something caught her attention. The trial was scheduled to be overseen by none other than Judge William Harper. Her stomach sank. It was official now. The judge who had dismissed her as a mere traffic offender was about to preside over the most significant trial of her career. The old frustration rose in her chest. She had known it was coming, but now that it was real, it felt different. He was the kind of judge who prized order and tradition above all else, the kind who assumed everyone would fall into their preordained roles. Danielle, however, had never been one to fit into any mold. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let a biased assumption about her stop her now. She didn't need to file a complaint or make a public statement. She wasn't here to bring down the system. She was here to prove that the system could work for people like her, people who had been overlooked for far too long. She was going to show Judge Harper who she really was, not just a prosecutor, but a force of nature that couldn't be underestimated. Danielle leaned back in her chair, staring at the files spread out across her desk. There was no turning back now. She had a case to win, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even a judge with preconceived notions, stop her. She'd made her way to this point by trusting herself and her instincts. She wasn't going to let anyone redefine her, especially not someone who didn't even know her true potential. As the days passed, Danielle's resolve grew stronger. The courtroom was about to become her battleground, and she would show Judge Harper and everyone else what it meant to underestimate her. It wasn't just about winning a case, it was about setting the record straight, about proving that the law belonged to everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. The day of the trial arrived with an energy that buzzed through the courthouse. Danielle arrived early, dressed in a sharp navy suit that was as much about confidence as it was about professionalism. She knew how to command a room, how to make her presence felt without uttering a single word. The moment she stepped into the courtroom, heads turned. Her colleagues gave her knowing nods of support, and even the defense team gave her a moment's glance that spoke volumes. They were already on edge. They knew she was good, but they had no idea just how much this case meant to her. Danielle had prepared for every possible challenge, and she knew she was about to face a formidable opponent. Victor Green, the businessman at the heart of the case. He was a man whose wealth and power had shielded him from any real consequences for years, and now finally, the law was coming for him. But the challenge wasn't just about Green. It was about everything that had led to this moment, about the years of systemic corruption that had allowed men like him to walk free. Danielle wasn't just fighting for a conviction. She was fighting for something bigger. She was fighting for justice. But today, there was an additional layer of tension in the air. Judge William Harper would be presiding over the case, and Danielle knew it wasn't just her skills as a prosecutor he would be judging. He was judging her, personally. His earlier treatment of her had stayed with her. And while she had resolved to focus on the case, the reality of his presence in the courtroom made her pulse quicken. It was difficult to keep her emotions in check when the very person who had so easily dismissed her was now going to be the one who held her future in his hands. When Judge Harper entered the courtroom, the room fell silent. He was every inch the image of authority, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Danielle watched him as he took his seat, trying to read his face. He didn't look directly at her, but his gaze flickered toward her a few times, a momentary glance that felt loaded with unspoken assumptions. She couldn't help but feel the weight of it, but she couldn't let it affect her. Not today. Today, she had a job to do. Judge Harper called the court to order, his voice firm but not unkind. "We are here today to hear the case of the United States versus Victor Green," he announced. "Miss Carter, please proceed with your opening statement." Danielle stood up, straightening her shoulders and taking a deep breath. As she began to speak, her voice rang out clear and strong. She didn't look at the judge or the defense. She focused solely on the jury, delivering her words with precision and power. She outlined the case against Green, detailing how his vast wealth had been built on a foundation of corruption, bribery, and deceit. She explained the impact his actions had on the community, the lives ruined by his shady dealings, and the way he had manipulated the system to protect himself for years. The judge remained silent, his face neutral. Danielle could feel his eyes on her, and yet she didn't let it faze her. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't going to let anything distract her. As the prosecution's opening statement came to a close, Judge Harper briefly acknowledged her. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said curtly, before turning his attention to the defense. The words felt empty to Danielle, but she didn't let it show. She had done what she came to do, and the ball was now in their court. Victor Green's lawyer stood next, presenting his client's case with all the charm and manipulation one would expect from someone used to getting away with anything. But Danielle wasn't worried. She knew the strength of her evidence. She had facts, documents, and testimonies that would expose Green for the criminal he was, and she would do whatever it took to make sure justice was served. As the proceedings continued, Danielle couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in the air whenever Judge Harper addressed her. It wasn't overt, but it was there. A brief moment of hesitation, a sharpness to his words, little things that told her he wasn't quite ready to accept her as an equal in this fight. But Danielle wasn't bothered by it. She had learned long ago that some people needed to be shown their own biases before they could confront them, and in this courtroom, she would be the one to force that reckoning. She was going to win this case, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been underestimated in the legal system, and she would make sure that Judge Harper understood just what kind of woman he had dismissed that day in traffic court. As the days of the trial passed, Danielle's resolve only grew stronger. Each witness she brought to the stand, each piece of evidence she presented, further tightened the noose around Victor Green. She was methodical, deliberate, and unrelenting in her pursuit of justice. With every turn, Green's defense team grew more desperate, more frantic in their attempts to discredit her case. But Danielle was one step ahead, anticipating every move they made, countering every claim with precision. The jury was captivated, and the evidence against Green was irrefutable. But there was still the matter of Judge Harper. His impartiality, or lack thereof, remained a constant presence in the room. He hadn't been openly hostile, but there was no denying that his demeanor toward her was colder than it should have been. It wasn't just the occasional glance or the slight pause before acknowledging her arguments. It was the subtle, almost invisible way he seemed to undermine her at every turn. Whether it was dismissing her objections a little too quickly or allowing the defense to drag out cross-examinations, it was clear that Judge Harper wasn't as fair as he claimed to be. His bias was not blatant, but it was there, creeping into every decision, every ruling. Danielle was no stranger to bias in the courtroom. As a black woman in a predominantly white profession, she had seen it all before. But something about Judge Harper's quiet condescension grated on her. It wasn't just that he was treating her differently. It was the fact that he hadn't even realized he was doing it. His assumptions about her worth, about her place in this space, were all baked into his every move. But Danielle refused to let it shake her. She was used to people doubting her. She was used to proving them wrong. And this time, she would make sure that Judge Harper saw exactly what he was dealing with. The pivotal moment came late in the trial, during Green's testimony. As the defendant took the stand, he was calm, collected, and supremely confident. His arrogance dripped from every word he spoke, his attempts to charm the jury as transparent as they were empty. But it was exactly this self-assurance that made him vulnerable. Danielle had studied Green meticulously, uncovering inconsistencies in his past, lies he had told to cover his tracks, and contradictions that could unravel his carefully constructed facade. As Green spoke, Danielle could feel the pieces falling into place. She knew exactly how to expose him, how to break through his wall of lies. When the time came, she stood, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "Mr. Green, you've testified that you were unaware of the corruption happening within your company, that you had no idea about the bribes your associates were taking," Danielle began, her gaze locked onto Green. "But the evidence we've presented to this court tells a different story. We have emails, phone records, and financial transactions that clearly show your involvement in these schemes. You were not a passive observer. You were an active participant." Green's smug expression faltered for just a moment. That small crack was all Danielle needed. She continued, methodically walking the jury through the evidence she had gathered, piece by piece. She demonstrated how Green had knowingly facilitated the bribes, using his company as a front for his illicit dealings. As she spoke, the room grew tense. Green's confidence was evaporating, replaced by the cold sweat of realization. He had nowhere to hide. Judge Harper, usually so stoic, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been quiet during Danielle's cross-examination, watching intently as the truth began to unfold. His gaze, once guarded, was now focused on Green with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. For the first time since the trial began, Danielle saw a flicker of something else in the judge's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. As she finished her questioning, she could sense the shift in the room. The jury was no longer leaning toward doubt. They were convinced. They had seen through Green's facade, and they understood the truth. But what struck Danielle the most was that, for the first time in the trial, Judge Harper wasn't merely playing the role of an observer. He was engaging with the case, processing it as she had hoped he would. The tension in the room was palpable. Danielle had fought hard for every inch of this case, and she knew that, in that moment, she had finally made her mark. She didn't need the judge's approval, but for the first time, she felt like he had acknowledged her. In that moment, Danielle Carter wasn't just a prosecutor. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Judge Harper, for all his previous biases, had no choice but to see it. The real victory, however, would come when Green was held accountable. That was the justice Danielle had been fighting for all along. The trial reached its final days, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. After Danielle's final cross-examination of Victor Green, the defense had little left to argue. The evidence she had presented was airtight, and her closing statements had left no doubt in the minds of the jury. Danielle had done everything she could to ensure that Green would be held accountable for his crimes, but now it was out of her hands. It was up to the jury to deliberate and decide his fate. Yet, as the court adjourned for the day, and the jury was sent off to deliberate, Danielle couldn't shake the feeling of eyes still watching her. Judge Harper, despite his seemingly neutral stance throughout the trial, had been subtly influencing the proceedings. She wasn't sure if it was intentional or if he had simply been operating from his biases without realizing it, but she knew that the judge's demeanor toward her had shifted as the trial had worn on. The night before the jury was set to return with their verdict, Danielle couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts of the trial and her career. There was no doubt in her mind that she had proven Green's guilt, no doubt that he was a corrupt, manipulative criminal who had used his wealth and influence to escape the consequences of his actions for far too long. But as she lay awake in the darkness, she realized there was still something else gnawing at her. It wasn't just about Green. It was about her own journey, about all the years of struggling to be seen, to be taken seriously in a world that often tried to define her by her race or gender rather than her capabilities. Judge Harper had been a representation of that system, the system that assumed she couldn't be a federal prosecutor, couldn't be a force to be reckoned with, simply because she was a black woman. The past few weeks had been a battle, not just for justice, but for recognition. The next morning, as the jury returned to the courtroom with their verdict, Danielle felt a wave of anticipation. The judge called the court to order, and the room went silent. Judge Harper, who had been aloof throughout the trial, seemed to be paying more attention now, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Judge Harper asked, his voice steady, but not as dismissive as it had been earlier in the trial. The foreperson of the jury stood up, holding the piece of paper that would decide Green's fate. "We have, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear. "We find the defendant, Victor Green, guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted into a murmur of approval, and Danielle's heart swelled. This was what she had worked for, what she had fought for. The jury had seen through the lies and the wealth, and they had chosen justice over influence. The sense of victory was overwhelming, but it was also a quiet kind of triumph, one that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. She had done her job, and she had done it well. As the room settled, Judge Harper finally turned his gaze to Danielle. His eyes locked onto hers for the first time during the entire trial, and for the briefest moment, Danielle saw something flicker in his expression. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was a recognition. Acknowledgement. He knew that, in this case, he had underestimated her, but there was something more. It was as if, in that moment, Judge Harper had finally understood the weight of his own assumptions. Danielle stood tall, her posture unwavering, as she watched Green being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He had lost, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the face of a prosecutor who had refused to be marginalized. As the room began to empty, Danielle felt a quiet sense of pride wash over her. She had made her mark, and she had done it in a way that would be remembered. Later that evening, as Danielle sat at her desk, preparing to leave for the day, she received a call from her boss, the head of the federal prosecution office. She had expected nothing less than praise for her work on the case, but this call was different. "Danielle," her boss said, "I've just been informed that Judge Harper has recommended you for a special position, a seat on the advisory board for criminal justice reform. He wants to work with you directly." Danielle felt a mix of emotions, a rush of surprise, then a flash of realization. Judge Harper had seen her. Finally, he had acknowledged her talent, her skill, her integrity. It wasn't just the case he had recognized. It was the work she had put in over the years to get to this point. A quiet smile crept across her face. Justice had been served, but so had something else. Her place in this world had finally been solidified, and nothing could take that away. The news of Judge Harper's recommendation hit Danielle like a thunderclap, though she quickly masked her surprise with a composed exterior. She knew this wasn't just about the win in the courtroom. It was about what came next. The Criminal Justice Reform Board was a prestigious position, one that would give her a platform to influence policy, to advocate for the very changes she had spent her career pushing for. But even more than that, it was a recognition of her place in the legal world, a place that had been so hard-won. Her first instinct was to decline. She had no need for validation from someone like Judge Harper, someone who had initially dismissed her and judged her based on his own biases. But as she sat there, looking out the window of her office at the city skyline, she realized something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the work she had done, the people she had fought for, and the larger battle that was still ongoing. If Judge Harper could come to see her value, then perhaps others would too. This was her chance to make real change, to influence the very systems that had once tried to silence her. That evening, Danielle attended a celebratory dinner with her colleagues. The mood was high, and everyone was eager to congratulate her on the success of the trial. But as they raised their glasses, offering cheers for her hard-fought victory, Danielle couldn't help but feel a sense of distance. She had won the case, yes, but she had won so much more than that. She had battled the system, not just in the courtroom, but within herself. She had fought to be seen, to prove that she belonged, and now that she was standing in the light, she had no intention of fading into the background. As the dinner wound down, Danielle's phone buzzed. It was an email from her assistant, forwarding a letter from Judge Harper's office. The letter outlined his recommendation in more detail, stating that his decision to offer her the position was not just based on her courtroom success, but on her long-standing dedication to justice. The words seemed to shine on the screen, a quiet acknowledgement of everything Danielle had worked for. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel a sense of vindication. But even as she read the letter, another part of her mind remained focused on the work ahead. This case had been a victory, yes, but it had also revealed just how much more needed to be done. The criminal justice system was still broken. There were still people like Victor Green, using their wealth and influence to escape consequences. There were still communities that faced the brunt of a system designed to keep them down. Danielle's work was far from over, and she knew this board position, if she accepted it, could be her way to create real change. The following morning, as she sat down at her desk, Danielle called her boss to confirm her decision. She would accept Judge Harper's recommendation. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. She had always known that. But now, with this opportunity in hand, she had a chance to make her voice heard on a broader scale. It was a seat at the table, a seat that, years ago, she had never thought she would be allowed to occupy. When the meeting with Judge Harper was scheduled, Danielle arrived with a quiet confidence. As she entered his chambers, he greeted her with a smile that, for once, felt genuine. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'm glad you agreed to meet. I want to formally offer you the position. I believe you can bring a unique perspective to the board, one that we sorely need." Danielle nodded, her gaze steady. "Thank you, Judge Harper. I'm honored by the opportunity, and I'm ready to get to work." It wasn't a full circle moment, but it was a step in the right direction. Danielle had earned her place, and now she had the chance to help shape the future of a system that had too often failed people like her. She wasn't just a federal prosecutor anymore. She was a voice for change, a force that couldn't be ignored. And for the first time in her career, she knew that, no matter what came next, she was exactly where she was meant to be. As weeks passed, Danielle settled into her new role on the Criminal Justice Reform Board with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Her days were filled with meetings, policy discussions, and strategic planning sessions. The work was challenging, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time, she wasn't just fighting individual cases, she was fighting for systemic change. The issues she had faced as a prosecutor, the obstacles she had overcome, were now the foundation for her advocacy. She spoke with authority on issues of racial disparity, inequality in sentencing, and the reform of bail practices. Her voice resonated in a way it never had before, and her ability to speak from lived experience made her an indispensable member of the team. But as much as she thrived in this new role, the ghosts of the past occasionally resurfaced. Judge Harper's initial treatment of her, his assumptions about her capabilities, stayed with her. She found herself reflecting on those early moments in the courtroom, the way he had barely acknowledged her presence and how, despite the weight of the evidence, he had taken every opportunity to undermine her. Yet, as she moved forward in her work, Danielle realized that those moments had become the fuel for her fire. She had always known what she was capable of. She didn't need his validation to prove it. Despite the changes, the legal world was still a place where power and privilege often dictated outcomes, and Danielle wasn't immune to its challenges. She still encountered colleagues who doubted her or sought to undermine her at every turn. There were still whispers about her being too aggressive, too passionate about issues that didn't concern everyone in the room. But Danielle didn't back down. She had learned the value of standing firm, of owning her space in a world that too often tried to shrink her. Every time someone questioned her, she became more resolute in her mission. Judge Harper's role in her journey wasn't lost on her. While she had accepted the position on the Reform Board, she had done so on her own terms. It wasn't about him. It was about the work. And as Danielle continued to advocate for the changes she believed in, she began to see a shift. Slowly, some of the judges and attorneys who had once doubted her began to change their tune. They listened to her ideas, acknowledged her expertise, and began to take her seriously in ways they hadn't before. Even those who still held on to their biases could no longer deny the impact of her work. One afternoon, several months into her new role, Danielle received an unexpected call from Judge Harper. The conversation was brief but meaningful. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone more respectful than it had ever been, "I wanted to thank you for your work on the Reform Board. The changes you've pushed for are already having a positive impact. I may have been wrong in the past, but I wanted to acknowledge your commitment and your ability to get things done." Danielle was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. She had known this day would come, but hearing it felt different, more like a shift in the air than a simple acknowledgement. "Thank you, Judge Harper," she replied, her voice steady but warm. "We're just getting started." It wasn't a grand gesture, and it didn't erase the years of marginalization she had faced, but it was a moment of recognition that Danielle had longed for in the past. It was proof that change was possible, not just in the law, but in people. Over time, Danielle's role on the Reform Board grew even more prominent. Her influence began to shape conversations on a national scale, pushing forward policies that would improve the lives of those most affected by the inequity she had spent her career fighting against. Her work began to inspire others, especially young Black attorneys and prosecutors, who saw her as a beacon of what was possible, despite the odds. Years later, when Danielle looked back on her journey, it was hard not to marvel at how far she had come. The woman who had once been dismissed by a powerful judge had become a key player in shaping the future of criminal justice reform. Her victories were no longer measured just in courtroom wins, but in the lives changed and the systems challenged. She had become a force for change, no longer needing validation from those who had once doubted her, but instead forging her own path and creating a legacy of justice and equity that would outlast even her. And in the quiet moments, when Danielle reflected on the twists and turns of her journey, she couldn't help but smile. She had never needed anyone's approval to prove her worth. She had always known what she was capable of. And now, the world did too.